in the pre-interviews and everything. Tell me a little bit about who you are and your relationship to Don.
Mm. So my name is Joseph Robinson. I go by Joe, and I am the eldest of 5 children. Uh, my brother Donald was the next to youngest sibling, and so yeah.
So, tell me a little bit about you guys growing up. You know, you talked a lot about your parents and tenement building
Mm-hmm.
and the projects
Mm-hmm.
and home life. Tell me a little bit about all of that.
Yeah. So we grew up mostly in East New York section of Brooklyn. It's still a rough and tumble section of New York City. Uh, we lived early on. We lived in tenement buildings in different places in East New York. And then in 1979, we moved. There was a fire, actually. We had a fire. At the time, wasn't sure who started the fire, but have since learned that I think one of my little cousins was staying over. It was like around Christmas time, and we had a fire, a really big fire. We all had to be carried out of the house in a burning apartment because the building, I learned, the landlord didn't pay the light bill or something like that, so there was no lights. And so anyway, so we had a fire, and we were taken to my grandmother's house in the Louis H. Pink houses, which is a very rough neighborhood, a housing development in East New York. So that was in '79. We stayed there for about a year, and then in 1980 moved back on our own, meaning me and my siblings and my mother, to 614 Bradford Street. I still remember that. And we still talk about how those were some of our best memories, right? For one, it wasn't the projects, and it was just us in terms of family. We stayed there to 1983, and I forgot why we moved. But we moved back to the Pink houses, and yeah, so we spent a lot of time in the Pink houses until I would say the mid to late '80s. Yeah.
Yeah. So talk to me about the mid to late '80s. Talk to me about what was going on during that time in you guys' life. And before you talked about how the crack cocaine epidemic
changed everything.
Changed everything and affected your lives.
Yeah.
Forever.
Yeah.
So let's go back to the '80s. So tell me about home life. Tell me about the moving back from project to project, 20 an apartment. At one time. Talk to me a little bit about that.
So like I said, in 1983 we moved from the tenement building apartment back to the Pink houses, and so it was a lot of us. Meaning, so initially it was just the 5 of us, me and my 4 siblings, including Donald, and my mom. My father and stepfather, Donald's father, we had 2 different fathers, were in and out of our lives. I would say Donald Sr., my stepfather, I spent more time with him than my own father. But it was nothing permanent. At some point, they weren't around. And so we moved back to the Pink houses in 1983. At the time, my grandmother, if I can remember, that was a long time ago, but my grandmother altogether had 10 kids. So they weren't all in the house, but I would say maybe a good 6 of them were, right? And then the others had they were adults, so they had their own lives and apartments. And then some of them had kids. So my Aunt Dolores, who is maybe a year or 2 younger than my mother, she struggled with drug addiction, and even back then. And so I guess, I don't know if she lost custody of her kids or not, but my cousins lived in the house with us. So there was 5 of us, meaning in terms of siblings, me and my siblings. There was my mother, there was my Aunt Dolores' kids, about 4 of them. There was my Aunt Nisi, my Uncle Stanley, other uncles. It was a lot of us. And we literally, the younger kids, because it was only three bedrooms. So 3 bedrooms in the projects in East New York. And so we slept on pallets, literally slept on pallets on the floor. So like blankets and quilts and stuff like that. And it was all sectioned off. It was like, this is your section. I mean, it was really crazy. And as you can imagine, food costs a lot to feed everybody. So from 83 to 85, that was our lives, basically. I was in junior high school at that time. So I would go from that section of East New York to another section where I went to junior high school. And then in 1985, or actually sometime, I think it was late 84, we moved again from the Pink Houses to, we were in the shelter, and I despised being in the shelter. It's just, I hated it. And so we went to a shelter in order for my mother to get her own apartment. That was like the process. We eventually moved to Harlem. That was different. Because even to this day, I mean, I live in Manhattan, live in the West Village, but I'm a Brooklynite. Like, it's in my blood, right? And so being in Harlem was different. Not necessarily bad, but just different. So it took me some getting used to it. I'm a teenager, and I'm missing my friends because they're all in Brooklyn. And I had a girlfriend at the time, so I wanted to spend more time with her. But yeah, so I would go, we lived on 134th between 7th and 8th. And it was like a 4th or 5th floor walk up. So that was different. At least the projects, we had elevators, right? So then I had to walk up the steps, right? And then I would go to 125th Street. That was nice. That was nice to go by the Apollo. Back then, there's a designer. He's with Gucci. Dapper Dan was big. And I mean, he was an adult. He's, much older than me. And so I would go check out some of the stuff, like his store and stuff like that. But anyway, so we stayed there for a while, and then we still don't know what actually happened, but we would go back and forth from Manhattan, where we lived, to Brooklyn. And at some point while we were visiting our grandmother, our apartment in Harlem was, some people say it was set on fire. I'm not sure what. So there's a lot of trauma all around. Lost all my belongings. I mean, luckily we didn't lose our lives. That was the most important thing. But the reason why I mentioned the belongings, because as a teenager, I was very much into fashion. In the 80s, it was all about fashion as a teenager. Reaganomics and all this. I mean, I didn't understand it then, but everything was about fashion. 1985, while living in Harlem, our mother, I wouldn't say go missing, but I would have to babysit more. So it was a lot. She wasn't around as much. So I noticed something was different. But what really signaled that my mother was abusing drugs, crack at the time, and I'll never forget, in her bedroom, I used to watch, because she had the color TV, we had a black and white TV, so I would go in her room, and she had back then, I'm sure, older folks can remember, they had the Betamax and the VHS and VCR, stuff like that. So I would watch, because I wanted to be a pilot. So Officer and a Gentleman was one of my favorite movies back then. I would watch it over and over again. Now that was Navy. I wanted to go Air Force, but still, it was close enough. And so I watched, An Officer and a Gentleman, and then while I was babysitting, my siblings were in another room, and when I went to put the cartridge back, right, to where I had gotten it, I think I bumped into I don't know, what was it? It was like a jewelry box or something like that by accident. And out came empty crack vials. And it was vials that I had seen, because I had our mother never, ever, ever, not I never saw her like use any drugs, anything like that. I mean, she drank like a beer or something like that. Even back then, she didn't even smoke cigarettes. So I was surprised to see, anything like that. The only reason why I knew what it was is because when I would go to school, I went to Park West High School on 50th between, I think, 10th and 11th. And they had a flight program. So I actually took flying lessons and all of that. And so the only way that I knew that it was crack even was because as I would go to school, I would see the crack vials on the streets. It was littered, like the whole community there was changing. And I was 15 at the time in 1985, and sometime when I would go to on my way to school, some women, some like just maybe a couple years older than me, like late teens, early 20s, would literally proposition me for sex. That was new. I was like, whoa, this, and I just keep going to school, and they'd be like, oh, you want to do something or whatever, and they was like selling their bodies. So I was like, this is real. So when I learned of, stumbled across the crack vials, I was devastated, as you could imagine, and as I put in a memoir that I wrote about that time. I said to and I never said this to my mother, she passed away, but I was like, wow, mom is one of them. That's how I saw it. It was painful. It was extremely painful, especially, it was my mother, but my mother doted on me. I was the oldest. I think my siblings teased me. I think I was a favorite. She didn't say that, but, so I was like, it was devastating. And, so in 1985, after the fire, we moved back to the pink houses. By then, in 85, it was a different pink houses. All the neighborhoods we stayed in was different because of crack. And it became much more violent. Younger people basically owned the streets. Basically, and I later became one of those people, not in that neighborhood, but in other neighborhoods. So we went from on Bradford in East New York, and Bradford primarily. We went from that, and even in Harlem, like being one close-knit family. We were close-knit, the five of us, and my mom and her boyfriend at the time. Close-knit, we ate dinner at the table together, said grace, and those type of things. So while we were, poor in terms of money, right? I felt, and I think my siblings, I don't know about Donald, because he got a lot of whippings. But we felt loved. I certainly felt loved, and I think my siblings did too. That changed once we moved back to the pink houses, and once it was clear to me, I couldn't say to my mom, "Hey, I discovered what's going on. What's this?" And in a lot of our communities, in the black community, like you don't talk back to your parents. I'm not saying that it happens in others, but it's a little different. So I couldn't question her. I didn't even think to question her. It's like I tried to keep it as my own secret. But then in 1985, like I said, it changed, and from 1985 to 87, it was just packed. We were in the pink houses. Everything was fast paced. People, like I said, young people making fast money. People's parents and other relatives were not only using the drug, but some of the women were selling their bodies for drugs, and some young girls. It was terrible. And some young guys. It was awful. It was an awful time. But it was like, this was our world. What do? You can't escape it. And, that was our world. And so that's so Donald and Lennox, for example, at some point started, because they had to fend for themselves. We all were fending for ourselves. I was the oldest, so by 1989, I went to college. But before that, let me just give you a quick chronology. From 87, in 87, I got arrested, right? Because I started getting in trouble. I started once my mother started abusing drugs, not putting it all on her, but we didn't have the maternal like supervision. It just wasn't there. She was not home a lot. Like we lived with my grandmother and uncles and aunts, and or aunt, and so it was just too much. Like people going in and out of the house, as you can imagine. And so my mother would be wherever she was, I guess, with friends and people getting high, basically. I mean, which was very different because she was always like I said, doting, and we were like her. I always say we were like her cubs. Like she was Mama Bear, so to speak, and we were like her cub. She had us in check. Like you know what I'm saying? Like that was different. So that it was just lost. It was just lost. And so I started hanging out with the wrong crowd, including some of my uncles, because I'm the oldest male in my generation, and started committing like crimes, even with my uncles sometimes. And that's how I made money to eat and to back then, like I said, to buy flashy clothes. That was, I look back now and think about how the whole stigma of poverty plays a big part in, people committing crimes or people doing other things that they shouldn't do. It's not just the poverty itself, but it's the stigma. So what do we do? What do a lot of people do? Not saying everyone who is poor, obviously, I'm not saying they commit crimes, but in certain neighborhoods it's more prevalent because I think on some level this stigma is such that we want to present to the world as if we have more than we have, like material, and we live in a capitalist society, so it's about what you have, right? We just don't understand those dynamics. And so 87, I spent 4 months on Rikers Island for a robbery that was committed with, I think it was like 3 or 4 of us, and I was the only one that got caught. Ended up spending 4 months on Rikers Island, and that was hell. That was hell. Rikers Island is crazy now. It's always in the news. People are dying now, like every month. Somebody's either taking their own lives or getting killed or whatever, or overdosing drugs. So it's always been a hellish place. It was bad in 87. I did 4 months, got my GED because I was a good student. I was a good student in school, so the first time I took it, I passed it. And I said, okay, I don't have to go to high school. I got my GED, always dreamed of being a pilot since I was like 9 because of my father, because my father was a pilot, so I wanted to be like my father. And but my point is that things changed in the 80s. 85, I always say that was like the dichotomy between when we had like a normal life and then chaotic, meaning just moving around. That's why I can't, like to this day, I can't really like deal with like instability, like any type of instability, like that moving around and all that, being unsettled. It really, really bothers me. Yeah.
Okay. So let's talk a little bit about the kind of person Donald was as a child, from your memory. What was Donald like?
So Donald, we always say that, or I always say that Donald was different. Obviously, we are all unique individuals, but from as far back as I can remember, I remember when Donald was born. It was December 5th of 1975, so I was 5 going on 6. And I remember we lived on Sumter Street in Brooklyn, a tenement building. And I remember going with Donald Sr. I mean, I still remember like it was yesterday, going to the hospital. My mother was still in the hospital. She had given birth to Donald, and we went to visit her because for some reason, I don't know if they didn't let her out the first day or whatever, but I still remember that. And so Donald, initially, I said initially, he was like any other kid, but by the time he was, I guess, 4 or 5 and going to school, started noticing that he would be acting up, as we would call it in school. I don't know, being mischievous and stuff. I remember once, and he still remembered it because we talked about it. I was in, I think, sixth grade. I think I was in sixth grade, and by then we were in the same school. So he was like in kindergarten or something like that. And I remember it was embarrassing because they called me on a PA system to go get him because he was acting up in class and the teacher felt like he was too much. And so I went and got him, right? And he stayed in class with me, and because it wasn't the end of the school day, and they was like, "Oh, basically, like, can you come get your brother?" You know, it was crazy, right? So I go get him, and he's like smiling and all, you know, happy to be with his big brother and all my classmates, and I'm like, you know, you're gonna get your ass whipped, you know, and that's exactly what happened, you know. So he hung out in class, and then we went home, and you know, told my mother I had to go get him from class because I don't know if it was that time or another time, but I think the teacher, you know, tried to grab him or something like that, and allegedly he like picked up a chair and hit her with a chair, like not over her head, but over like her hand or something like that. I forgot the details. That was so he got a serious whooping because of that. Nobody else did that. That's what I mean by he was different in that we knew to quote unquote behave ourselves in general, but especially in public and in school. And so so Donald was that, like, he was very curious, and I wouldn't say he wasn't bad. I wouldn't say he was like bad as we would say, but he was he was mischievous. I remember another time, he remembers this as well. I had some type of something. It might have been like a Christmas gift, and it was so Donald, Lennox, and Giselle at one time when we lived on Bradford, they all shared a bedroom. It was a bigger bedroom, and then me and Sean had the other bedroom. And so Donald, I had some toy up in my closet, and
Stop for a second.
yeah, so
You remember something about Donald?
yeah, so he, like I said, Donald, Lennox, and Giselle, our sisters, shared one bedroom, and me and my brother Sean shared another bedroom, and my mother had obviously her own bedroom. And I guess while I was at school or whatever, I wasn't in the house, and Donald tried to climb up. He tried to climb up in my closet, and to get my toy, whatever it was. And he fell on his shoulder and dislocated his shoulder. So, like I say, he was always just like, I mean, this kid stuff. It's kid stuff. But I think what, as far as like how Donald was as a kid, like, you know, like he didn't give me like any problems. So it wasn't like like he didn't challenge me. He wasn't like bad in that way. But he was just, you know, curious, mischievous, and one thing I noticed, and I'm sure my siblings did too, is that every now and then I would notice like he would have, there was a certain look, like for lack of a better word, like a certain intensity of, you know, his gaze that was different than any of us. Right? It was just something. It's hard to describe, but it was. But what I didn't remember, I don't know why. I knew he had to go to, that he was in special ed, and he had to take a bus, like a separate bus, like they would pick him up and take him to school. But I think, one, my mother didn't talk about it, so in some way that's a good thing, because we didn't think that he was like different, so to speak, than any of us in any way. Like, she didn't make, you know, it didn't seem like he was different. But clearly he had learning disabilities, and he had, some mental health issues. But back then, people didn't, especially people of color, did not talk about mental health. It was not even a phrase. Like, you know, like people didn't even talk about it. Now, increasingly we talk about it, but now there's still a stigma behind the whole thing. But yeah, so we never really talked about it, but we all knew that he was that sometimes his behavior was odd, and that he'd have, like I said, an intense, kind of look, and I'd be like, what is he thinking? Like that. And to myself, I would say, like, what is he thinking? But one thing that really stood out, and me and my brother Sean and sister Giselle always talked about, and Donald talked about, was how when he did act up or do something that caused my mother to whip him, we talked about how extreme it was, right? And it was crazy. Like no one else. I don't know why. If she was alive now, I would ask her, like, why did you hit Donald the way you did? Like when I got whippings too, not as often, but I did. And it was not to that extent. For some reason, I don't know why, with Donald. And as punishment, she would, like I said, several times, she has, like, put him in a closet. I remember when we lived on Bradford Street, as soon as you came in the door, on the right was the bathroom, and it opens into a kitchen right there, but right to the left there was a closet, and she'd be whipping him in the kitchen or whipping him from the bedroom to the kitchen, and then say go in the closet as if I don't know what that was to, like, and it was I wanted to cry. I'm be honest, it was so, because I didn't get it. I was like, why? What are you? But I couldn't, like, talk back to her or anything. I was like, why is she doing that? No, she didn't. She didn't do that with anybody else. Not anyone. It's 5 kids, but with Donald she did it. So I don't know why she did it. One other point I would make: it wasn't until many years later that I learned, even as the oldest, that when Donald was born, when Donald was born, the umbilical cord was wrapped around his neck and cut off oxygen, and that explained why. Because I never knew that all my life. Like, I never knew that until he got arrested for these crimes, and then everything came out in discovery and all that. But prior to that, like, it was never brought up. It's not like my mom said or our mother said. Like, explained it to us. Like, this is why Donald acts a little like that. Because I think that would have made a big difference. Like, my approach to him, whatever that was, I think would have been different. I would have been more sensitive. And I may have even, I don't know, but I may have even, like, if she whipped him, I would have been like, Mom, you said, he's got, whatever, that, he didn't have all his oxygen going to his brain, so he's not functioning. I don't know if I would have did it, but I think if I knew, I think we would have been talking about it. I probably would have went to my grandmother or one of my uncles or something like that and said, oh, Mom is on that, why is she doing it, knowing this. I mean, she knew it because she came, from her. So yeah, but we didn't know it. Yeah.
So it sounded like there was some intellectual disability from the beginning.
From the beginning, there was intellectual, and I didn't know it. I just thought, that's his personality. I wasn't smart enough to know that there was a such thing as mental retardation, as they called it back then, or any of that. I just knew it was. It was like, okay, like my mother, like that's for her to know and figure out. So, it was out of beyond my ken, as they say, beyond my understanding.
So, talk to me a little bit about Donald and Lennox having to fend for themselves, because you gave an interesting, heartbreaking type story about when there was no food and what they had to do to survive.
Yeah. So, because I like to put a time stamp on it, so to speak. In '87, in January, I did 4 months on Rikers Island. During those 4 months, my mother and my siblings, including Donald, went to at least one, maybe 2 different back then they call them welfare hotels, right? So that was like it was transitional housing, right? Not meant to be permanent housing, but transitional. But you could be there for years. And but by the time I got out in May of '87, from January to May, by then they were back with my grandmother, so it just kept going back. And Donald and Lennox, and I worked until I went to college upstate. Donald and Lennox would pack bags, right? That was their like hustle to make money. I'd learned later they started committing robberies. We talking about, let me see, '87, I was 17. So Donald had to be like 11, right? 11, 12, something like that. It's crazy, and Lennox was 2 years younger than him. And they were hanging out with one of our cousins, and so they committing petty crimes, but also packing bags to buy food for themselves. And Donald, the one part that like literally breaks my heart, it was, and this is in some of my conversations with Donald on the phone like last year. This part is hard, but I'll never forget Donald saying, especially when he knew that the execution was going to be imminent, when the courts had just basically said, when the U.S. Supreme Court basically said you can go ahead with these executions. I'll never forget him, crying on the phone and saying, I did something to the effect like I never wanted to hurt anyone. And not just the victims of his crime. He's talking about all crimes, anything he's done. He said, I never wanted to rob people. That's what he said. He said, I never wanted to rob people. He's talking about in New York City, in East New York, or wherever else he committed crimes. And he said, man, I was doing stuff so I can eat, so I can have food. And that just like tears me up. And there's probably lots of people across the world who commit crimes to eat, stuff that we take for granted. Donald talked about picking up stuff off the ground in East New York. I mean, stuff that, I was away in college at some point, so I wasn't privy to that. So it's just, he had a rough life, and that's not to minimize the crime. I will never do that, but I think it's important to contextualize things, not to try to explain it away, but to contextualize things to have a better understanding of the human beings that we're talking about.
So there was a story about them picking up gum off the street.
Picking up gum off the street to have some type of sustenance, right? I mean, unbelievable. So it was stuff like that that I learned early on when and that prompted me to write the memoir because I was like, oh shit, this is a whole part of my brothers, both of them, Donald and Lennox, lives that I had no idea, and that's why when I had shared with them about, Donald, I think it was Donald, when I shared that I was on a conjugal visit, it triggered in him. To him, it was like, oh, you're living a good life. I had to, I'm sure it triggered in his mind, I had to eat gum off the ground or pick up food off the ground. Of course, I couldn't know that, and it wasn't my fault that he experienced that, but that really brought it home for me about Donald's life, my mother's life, our lives, and how the crack cocaine epidemic just really turned our families' lives inside out, and so many people's lives.
That's rough, man.
Mm-hmm.
So let's go to probably the most difficult part of this interview, about the murders and everything and what happened with Donald.
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to stop.
They were tested for intellectual disability.
Yeah, Donald was tested. I believe probably, I think several times as he was, quote unquote, preparing to go to trial, right? So, yeah, he was tested several times for competency as well, to see if he was competent to stand trial. And I think,
Sorry, can you get that bell?
I heard a little bit, yeah.
Yeah.
Want to start again if you?
Yeah, let's hold off until.
Mhm.
That's it, I think.
Oh, all right. So.
yeah, because it's right down the block.
All right. Yeah, it's rolling. Wait for the truck to pass.
Yes. To your knowledge, was Donald ever evaluated for intellectual disability?
Yeah, Donald was tested, I think, a number of times as he was, like after his arrest. For, I think the crime, I think it happened in 2001. And he was tested for competency purposes. And if I remember correctly, he was deemed incompetent and competent and incompetent. It kept going back and forth. He was on psychotropic drugs. They were trying to get it, out of whatever. They had him on drugs. And then ultimately he was deemed competent to stand trial. And I have my own opinions about that, and I'll just say, whether you keep it or not. But I think race plays a part in that as well, meaning that he was found competent to stand trial, so that he would be treated differently throughout the process, and that he would be executed. I mean, I think if you ask me, I think it was a foregone conclusion. And it's not conspiracy, it's just the world we live in. His victims, 2 white women. I mean, I don't have to say any more.
I'm going to ask you this.
Sorry.
I'm going to stop you 1 second. Okie dokie.
Okay, so you said that you felt like race
Yeah,
was a factor into.
Yeah, so I think that, and I mean, it's just my gut feeling, and I would say educated guess, is that so Donald was, like I said, kind of off and on or intermittently deemed competent and incompetent, competent and incompetent to stand trial. Ultimately, he was deemed competent, and which means that he was able to, go to trial, all right? And that the punishment part, the execution, they can go forward on that. And so I do think that race plays, not just in his case, but I think in many cases, especially when the defendant is black or brown, and the victims are white. I mean, it's not new. It's nothing new in America. So I think Donald was, a part of that as well. And again, I'm very sensitive to the victims in this case as well. And I'm not just saying that, like I did time, and I'm sensitive to the victim in my case. So, yeah.
So, what was going through your mind, or how did you take the news, or what was your understanding of?
Well, yeah, we'll stop it till the
Go. You go ahead.
So I was incarcerated at the time that Donald committed the crime in 2001. I was way upstate New York, and in prison, 5 Points Correctional Facility. I called home. I called my sister. When I say home, I called different people, but called my sister just to say hey and just to let her know how I was doing. And when I called her, I forgot what month it was, she said Donald she said the police came to my house. I don't know if they kicked in the door. She was living in the Bronx at the time with my niece and nephew, her 2 kids. And she was in college, I think, back then, and whatever, just living her life. And Donald and I forgot the woman's name, but there was an older woman, older than him by several years, that they both came to her house. Donald told our sister, I believe, what had happened, and shortly thereafter, the police came because I think something about some phone call or whatever. They were able to trace it and track him down, right? So, but anyway, so when she told me, so they came, the police came, they arrested him and Donald and the girlfriend. They had come from Oklahoma to New York City, and I'm trying to remember, so my sister was saying how scared like she was and the kids were, and I'm like I don't even know. In other words, I was like shocked or surprised, even though I know he had some mental disabilities. We didn't call it that, but I clearly knew he was different. And like I said, sometimes he would kind of like not stare, but yeah, kind of like stare into space or something like that. So I knew something was a little different. I couldn't imagine that. I just couldn't imagine that. Like what? Because I was like, what happened? And so she said, well, they said, he killed 2 people in a hotel, and blah. I'm like, oh my. Oh my God, like what made him, like what was he thinking? And I don't know if she told me then, but I have since, meaning my sister, I don't know if she knew all the details, but since learned that the girlfriend was maybe 8 or 10 years older, or something like that he had met her when he was staying with our mother in Oklahoma City, I think at the time. And what I've learned too, this is from my sister and my mother, but what I learned was that she used drugs as well. So she used drugs, meaning like crack, presumably. And Donald, I remember growing up, and I think this is important because when growing up, we were all young, but he was younger, and we never saw Donald like with a girlfriend, so to speak. Not that that means anything per se, but like I had girlfriends, Sean had girlfriends, Lennox was too young, but as he got older, he had girlfriends. And Donald, I wouldn't say he was a loner, but he didn't have girlfriends. So I think that when he met this woman, what my mother said, my mother's, and I mean this in a good way, mother's not crazy, but in a funny way. My mother said to me, we would have weekly calls, like over the first couple of years that when I came home, and she said that my mother said she never liked the woman, like she knew of her, I guess from the neighborhood, and my mother probably was still getting high off and on, right? We have no proof of that, but I'm pretty sure that was the case, and so she knew of this woman, and she felt that Donald not having a lot of experience with women, that he was, the term that we used growing up was open, like he was like really in love with her, he thought, meaning once they had sex, he was like, oh my God, and that coupled, meaning his lack of experience with women, coupled with his mental disability, I think he personally, and I said this to my siblings after his execution and even before, that I think that he was seeking our mother's love from this woman, right? I never said that to him, but I thought it a long time ago. And I really do believe that's the case. So he was willing to do whatever to prove how much he loved her and he tended to be like, he's like a loyal person. Like if he loves you, he loves you, like that. And because he didn't get it, or felt that he didn't get it from our mother, that he sorted out with this woman. And so she got arrested for something, I don't know. And he went to, and so this is what he told me. She knew, I think she used to work at the hotel, La Quinta Hotel. So she knew the staff, she knew whatever, how they operated, and basically set it up. Basically said, because he was locked up, and he was, she was locked up, and he was like trying to get bail money. So they came up with this stupid idea, the two of them, that he would rob the clerks or whatever, the two victims, that he would rob them and bail her out. The part, that's bad enough. That's bad enough. They're just doing their job, so that's bad enough. The part that really also makes me sad, the loss of any life is unfortunate and sad, especially in a traumatic way. But the part that really also makes me sad is that, to me it was mental health, but or honesty, or both. But I remember watching Donald's clemency hearing, like literally watching it with my wife, and my siblings watched from their respective homes. And when they asked him, and I thought it was so manipulative and mean, because they knew they had mental health issues, but they said, they said something like, you had made up your mind that you weren't going to let anyone go, right? Like when you committed this crime, there were going to be no witnesses, right? Now the average person would lie. Mm-hmm. I don't care who you are. The average person would say, no, that wasn't a plan. He said, yeah. He said, yeah. So he said, and it wasn't like in a callous way. It was just like matter of fact. He was like, yeah, well, I'm something like I'm from Brooklyn and I'm from New York City, and so it's a lot of basically like there's a lot of races. He didn't use these words, but basically a lot of races and ethnicities. So if I had committed the crime there, it was like very straightforward. Like if I had committed the crime in the city, I could blend in and get away. But this is Oklahoma. This is mostly white people, and so I knew I couldn't get caught. There couldn't be any witnesses. This is what he said. And I was stunned as I watched it. Now for some people they may say, oh, that sounds like a hardened criminal. To me that sounds, because most people wouldn't do that, and most people wouldn't say that, right? I wouldn't say that, right? That said to me that he did not fully comprehend not only the crime and going through with it in the way that he did it, but in the retelling of it. That he didn't get the impact, like how that could be construed, right? That could make him seem really callous. I think if he understood that, he wouldn't have said it, all right? So it's just stuff like that that is really, like sad all around, yeah.
So in our chat, you mentioned that Donald didn't stand a chance. That all these different systems failed them. So can you explain that a little bit?
Yeah, I think for me, when I look back, like from... Yes.
You made Donald didn't stand a chance. Talk to me about what you meant by that and the different systems that you think failed him.
Yeah, so I think... one, like I said, growing up, I didn't know. We didn't have a word for like mental health, therapy. Those were I didn't even know that they existed. That type of stuff, right? And so although Donald was in special ed, he was in special ed, and I do remember him being picked up for school on the yellow bus. There was a stigma about that. Oh, he's on the yellow bus. That means he's slow. That was the way people would say it back then, right? Or he's retarded, you know, and I know they don't use that term now, but that's the way they talked back then, and there was a stigma behind it. And so I feel that the school system, even now, there's not a lot of resources that go into like people in special education and stuff like that. So I think he was failed, you know, in that way. I'm going that far back. Yeah. But also, I think that our mother, I think that in terms of the family, you know, for whatever reasons, she didn't talk about Donald in that way in terms of mental health. As an adult, I wish she had, because I think, I don't know how, but I think it would have made a difference if we would have understood that that the fact that he had a lack of oxygen going to his brain for whatever, however long it was, and how that impacted his thinking, his cognitive abilities. I think that would have made a difference in how I treated him and how all of us treated him. Not that we treated him badly, but, you know, we would have just approached him differently, right? Or understood him in a different way. And so I think the fact that my mother didn't, for whatever reason, didn't talk about it, and the fact that she, when she did beat him, that she beat him the way she beat him, right? And punished him whatever the way she punished him, that in that way she failed him. That she failed him, right? So you got the family as an institution. I think there was some failure, for lack of a better word. The school system. And then once I started getting in trouble and my mother was abusing drugs, then he got, at some point he and Lennox and started getting in trouble, and they were at one point when I was in college, they went to a group home. I had never been in a group home, so that, like I said, it just really, the crack epidemic just really destroyed the family. So they're in a group home. They may have gotten evaluated. He may have gotten evaluated. I'm not sure. But I don't recall him ever telling me, for example, that he went to therapy, right? That he had somebody to talk to.
You started off with saying you don't remember anybody saying he went to therapy.
Yeah, so I don't remember Donald ever saying, or my mother or anyone saying that he went to therapy, and I think that could have benefited him. And again, with the whole stigma of incarceration and the cost, we grew up poor, so the cost of therapy. And like I said, the stigma back then, to be honest, was like, oh, that's for white people, other people. I mean, that's the thinking, right? It's like, oh no, we're, and I think that's a, what do you call it, kind of like a residual thing from slavery. Like, we have to be tough. We can endure this stuff. No, you got to be human. That's what I learned. We're all human, right? So it's not about like sticking it out and toughening it up and stuff like that. But that's what Donald ended up doing. So so throughout juvenile, because he was in juvenile detention centers, and I remember visiting him in North Carolina, for example, in 1991, when he was in one of those, I think it was I forgot the name, something training school or something like that. He had gotten in trouble, and he and Lennox, our baby brother, was staying there. And in this country in particular, and I'm just gonna be brutally honest, right? When it comes to, and this is nothing new, but when it comes to race and crime, a lot of factors come into play. And again, I'm not trying to explain away my brother's crime. I just want to emphasize that, and that I value uh, everyone's lives, including the victims. They did not deserve that. I will say that on the record. They did not deserve to die, right? But when it comes to race and crime, this is a centuries old idea that when it comes to black people and people of color, that it's inherent, it's natural. This is not saying everyone, but some people believe, well, that's what they do. They commit crimes. And so there's no thought about therapy, environment. In fact, people will say that those are excuses. Like, oh, when you say that stuff, those are excuses. Like, really? But now when you have, for example, some traumatic event, we see it all the time on TV. You have a Columbine, you have those where it's predominantly white people. What do they talk about? Therapy, treatment. They don't talk about that when it comes to black. I mean, is that, like, it has to be a reason why. So in other words, because some people are valued over others. Some narratives, some stories are told about some groups over, in a different way than others. But my point is that, so Donald, I think, throughout was failed, including my mother. I'm not saying she was a terrible person, but what I am saying is that she did fail him. There's no question about it. And I think that he committed the crime because he was seeking out her love, and that breaks my heart. It breaks my heart, period, but it especially breaks my heart because, I don't feel guilty about it, but because my mother doted on me. Like, I always felt loved. He did not. And and I know that because he has alluded to it, in my conversations with him. And in another interview, and then I have a YouTube video, he said it. He's pretty much said it. I never, I'm just going to say it. He's like, I never felt fucking loved or something like that by my own mother. And I never knew he had said that. So that's something to carry, for anybody to carry throughout their own life, that their mother or father doesn't love them. I mean, that's, I don't even know what that's like. I I didn't experience that. So it's just tragic, man. It's tragic.
You said that he made the comment that he felt like he was born into the wrong family.
He did say that. He did. He told me that. Yeah, he told me
tell
that.
me, when you explain that, just start off by saying,
Yeah.
you told me that you
Right.
were born into the wrong family.
Yeah, so in at least one, but maybe 2 or 3 of my conversations with Donald, and this is in the last months of his life. So he would call me, and we'd have these long conversations, deep conversations. Sometimes he'd get angry with me about something, or I'd get angry with him about something. It was extremely stressful, and for both of us, just extremely stressful and otherworldly. I have to say that first. I'm talking to my brother. Could just imagine. I'm talking to my brother, my baby brother, as I call him, on the phone, knowing that in a matter of months he's going to be dead. He's going to be executed. That was, even as I would talk to him, I would say, this is weird. Like, this is weird. I wouldn't wish that on an enemy. It was just weird. But anyway, so a couple of times. I know it was more than once, but the first time he said it, my jaw dropped. He was like, I was born into the wrong family. I was like, what do you mean? And he just, because I think he was manic depressive too, and bipolar. So he has a couple of things he was diagnosed with. And so, you can be joyful in one moment and then frantic and, another moment. And I was like, I said, I heard him out because he just was going on. Like, oh, I was born into the wrong family. My mom's, meaning our mother was a, and he was direct too. He was like, it was a crack addict or crackhead, he may have said. My father was alcoholic, which was true. And and then he started mentioning other family members. Oh, this uncle was no good. Man, I was born into the wrong family, man. So I knew what he meant. I love my family. I believe he loves the family. I think that was his way of saying what I always felt, is that he did not stand a chance. So I think that's what he meant when he said I was born into the wrong family, meaning that if I had born into a family that not necessarily, one, maybe if they came from a different socioeconomic background, that could make a difference, right? But also, the crack era was devastating. And that's always the they say the pink elephant in the room, so to speak, because I believe, I don't know, but I believe had we, meaning the country and the world, not experienced the crack epidemic, that would have been just any typical black family, whatever. But I don't think I would have been committing crimes. I don't think I would have went the route that I took. I don't think that he would have taken a route that he took. So I say that to say that I think it's more than our family. I think it was the environment and the times, because it does matter. It does matter. But that's how he felt. He felt that he was born into the wrong family. That's what he said.
It's amazing what poverty can do
Mm-hmm.
to folks and to families.
Mm-hmm.
And we look at poverty as this, it's, just, we have programs to help feed people and
Mm-hmm.
everything, but it's more than that.
That's much more to
And it's just interesting with that.
and it's demoralizing. It's demoralizing. It's crippling. Emotionally and psychologically crippling. I really believe that. Yeah.
Yeah. Do you remember the last conversation you had with Don?
Oh boy, yeah, that gets me. Yeah, that gets
You
me.
don't want to talk about it, that's fine.
I gotta go. I don't. Yeah, I'm trying to think. Yeah, I remember. This one's hard. That's a hell of a question. Yeah, the last conversation. This one is hard. The last conversation that I had with Donald, I was in Oklahoma, and this was a day before he was to be executed. I remember it like it was yesterday, and I can tell you the day. And I know because his execution was on the January 27th of this year, of 2022. I'll never forget it for a couple reasons. One, because I was there and witnessed it with my brother and my wife and other people. My anniversary is on the 25th of January. So we flew out there on our anniversary. On our 17th anniversary, my wife and I flew out there. So it was, so we flew out there. Then I saw him on the 26th, the day before. And we spoke. It was a non-contact visit. That broke my heart. That broke my heart because yeah, that one is hard. That broke my heart because here it is, I hadn't seen my brother. And think about it, almost 30 years. Almost 30 years. The last time I saw Donald, meaning in the free world, as they say, was 1991 in North Carolina when he was in a training school. And I got arrested in 92. And I did 25 years, believe it or not. People can't, I mean, can't look at me and tell, obviously, but I did 25 years. So didn't see him during that time. And then his crime happened while I was inside. So I'm visiting him in this it looked like a tomb or like an underground cemetery or something like that. The prison, the Oklahoma State Prison, with the construction of it. And it was non-contact. I didn't get to touch my brother. That's what really messed me up. In New York State, for example, it's much different. Prison is rough, don't get me wrong. But unless you are in like solitary confinement or something like that, you have contact visit. So when my wife or friends or anybody visit, you get to hug, touch their hands, you get to feel like a human being. He didn't get that. Now some people might feel, I'm sure the victims' families and people who are advocates of the death penalty, because I'm aware that there's more than my opinion. But he was still a human being. You can say it evil, bad. He's a human being first. That we're all human beings first, right? I think we should be able to agree to that. And we had to like touch hands on the glass, and it's not the same. Couldn't hug my brother. I mean, I was able to tell him I love him, and he told me he loved me. We talked a lot, but I couldn't like hug him. Couldn't, that really broke my heart. So we had the visits on the 26th. And then, several weeks prior to that, I received paperwork from OSP, Oklahoma State Penitentiary, that explained, the process, everything. What time we had to be there and everything. What was going to happen, when it was going to happen. It was just so cold and calculated. And so on the 26th, I saw him on a visit. Then after the visit, I stayed there about 5-6 hours. Stayed there, let me stay for about 5-6 hours. So there were only 2 visitors allowed at a time, but there were me and 2 of my siblings. So Donald wanted me to be there throughout, right? I'm the oldest. And I was there for him, meaning there for him more than anybody else. That's just what it is. Meaning he knew he could rely on me. I'm gonna be honest, that gave me some solace because I still had guilt from our younger years when I felt I wish I could have done something differently. So I felt like I was there for him. So, I believe my sister, I think my brother Sean visited with me first with Donald. Like, in other words, we had someone bring us to the prison, and Sean and I visited with Donald. I stayed. Sean had to leave after about 2 hours or something like that, per their rules. And then my sister came for the second half, so I stayed the duration. And we talked, we reminisced, we cried, all of us, at different times. And then, it's crazy. And then after the second visit, the second part of visit, we like I said, we cried. We knew that was the last time we was gonna see him like that. And so we went back to the car. Went back to Oka. We went and got something to eat after, away from the prison. And went back to wherever we were staying at the hotel. And it's crazy. It's crazy thinking about it. And so that night he called. And that was the last time we spoke. He called. My siblings were there. And I'm trying to think who else. I think we had some friends of the family or something like that. And so I got my 2 siblings, went to the side, and I don't know exactly what we said we loved them, but I don't know, what we said. And yeah, I'll just leave it at that.
I'm going to ask you about this. If you don't want to jump into this, that is fine. But, let me know when you're ready, Joe.
Okay.
Yes, I remember in like 1987, late 1987, 88, when Donald and Lennox packed bags to make a living. So they would go to neighborhood stores and ask the cashier, can I pack bags? And they said, sure, and that's how they made a few extra dollars, right? That was their hustle, so to speak, so that they could buy food for themselves. And I remember at different times Donald and Lennox coming to me as the big brother and saying that our mother was stealing their money, their hard-earned money, right? So not only, and I'm not saying this in a bad way, but not only was she at this point, as I told her, I said it's like we had two mothers, right? One up until 1985 and then a different mother, right? When she started abusing drugs. So not only was she, I'm going to say, incapable, because I believe in her heart she wanted to, and her and I talked about that she wanted to be a mother, but the drugs took over, right? But not only was she not being the mother that we knew, that I knew, that with maternal instincts, where she would provide for us in different ways, but now she was taking. It was unbelievable. That's what crack did, right? It robbed people's souls. I mean, seriously, it really did something to people. And so she would steal their money while they were asleep. We slept on pallets. Like I said, we paused about 15, 20 of us in the house. And so it was about maybe 8 of us in the living room, all like it's campgrounds, right? And so I remember Donald and Lennox at different times telling me that our mother was stealing their money. I was like, I was pissed off. I was pissed off. Because first of all, she wasn't being the mother that, we knew and deserved. And now she was stealing from them. And although we grew up not to challenge like our mothers and elders, I said, okay. So I said, put an end to that. In my mind, I said, I'm going to put an end to that. So sure enough, late into the night or early in the morning, I don't remember, it was dark out. We were sleeping, or at least lying down. And I remember my mother coming into the house, tiptoeing. Literally, I'm not making this up. Tiptoeing on the pallets, going over to, this time I remember Lennox, I don't know if I remember Donald, but going over and rifling through his pockets. And I said, and I would never do it. I would never do it. Because I was just, just like you respect your mother, I'm afraid of your mother, even, so, and I said, what are you doing? And it startled her. Like really startled her. It was dark, like you just had the lights from outside the window, and it startled. She stopped, and she was like, "Boy, don't question me," something like that. I said, so I just spoke up because this is my little brother. I was like, "Man, the hell with this." So I said, what are you doing? Are you stealing his money? I said, "Mom, you taking his money or something like that?" "Boy, don't talk back to me, blah blah." But she left out. She didn't take the money. So that's how low it had gotten, man, and that's what we dealt with as a family, and that's what Donald and Lennox dealt with, man. They're trying to feed themselves, eating off the ground, packing bags, then later robbing people, stuff like that, and then it just was crazy. It was crazy.
That's crazy. Yeah.
That is crazy.
So let's go back to
the 27th.
The 27th. I know this is tough to get.
Yeah.
Talk to me about you being one of the witnesses. Because he asked for you to be there, right?
Yeah, no, he definitely wanted me to be there.
And talk to me what went down, the protocols, and what was going through your mind. I guess we can all
imagine,
your mind,
right?
But,
Why not just hold on a second, Jim?
Oh, that beat.
Back,
Oh,
back.
yeah, the truck. Yeah.
Okay.
So talk to me about the 27th. What went down, protocols and everything. Donald wanted you to be one of the witnesses.
Right. So, and so yeah. So Donald wanted me to be a witness to his execution. I thought it was. I don't know if I say crazy request because of the ordinary. I would never, under any other circumstances, be a witness to anything like that. I just would not. I'm against the death penalty. I think it definitely falls within the purview of the Eighth Amendment of the Constitution, the U.S. Constitution, cruel and unusual punishment. I don't believe that the state should take a life just like it pronounces that individuals should not take a life. But yeah, so he wanted me to be there, and I forgot exactly when he first asked me, but in my mind I was like, are you kidding me? Like, are you really asking me this? And I don't remember the exact words, but I definitely remember telling him that I didn't feel comfortable with it, but if that's what you want, then that's what I'm going to do. Then I want to be there. We knew, meaning my family knew at some point it would happen, right? At some point, right? Now, he was, I think on death row for 15, 16 years or something like that, and 5 years, like going to trial and all this other stuff. So, and in the U.S., often people on death row for a long time like that. So we knew it was eventually would happen, but then when it's like imminent, then it becomes real. And he wanted, siblings, and so we made it happen. Right, there was a lot of logistics to make it all happen. A lot of stress and going back and forth with the administration and all of that. Their protocol is interesting. So Oklahoma, once it is affirmed that there's going to be execution, and once a person is approved, as I was, to be a witness, they send you a packet. So I received a packet in the mail and it was like 35, a little bit longer than 35 days out. So they literally took him from one cell to a holding cell specifically for people who are about to be executed. So they stripped him of a lot of his belongings. So it's like walking the gallows, and you're about to be killed by the state. Sent me the packet. I read over it. I still have it. And they explained the procedures. They explained it in great detail. 10 o'clock, no, what did they say? That we had to be there by 8 o'clock in the morning on the 27th, January 27th of 2022. They needed license plate numbers and all this other stuff, where we were to arrive, and that they would then pick us up and then take us to this other, the building where it was going to take place. So my siblings and I that morning, we said a prayer after breakfast or before breakfast. We said a prayer. For my part, I just kept saying, this is crazy. Like, they don't have the death penalty in New York State. So I'm like, this is crazy. I couldn't even wrap my mind around it. And so while we were driving to the prison, it was mostly quiet because we know what's going to happen. And for us, and I say us because it wasn't just me, for us it was, and it remains, and it's always going to be this way for the rest of my life. It's in terms of Donald, again, I do feel terrible about the victims. I will say that again. Right? Nobody should die like that. Right? Period. Right? But for Donald, it's bigger than Donald. I can't think about Donald's death and his life without thinking about my mother. I can't. It's inextricably intertwined, right? And then the crack era. So it's all I can't like just like tease them out and separate them, anything like that, right? And so, I remember, I think I said it to my sister or brother, while we were going to the prison on the 27th to witness his execution, I became angry at my mother. I love my mother, but I became angry because I felt that, and it may not sound real because addiction is, and I'm sympathetic to people, addicted because I was exposed to it. But, the if you want to say the inner child in me, so to speak, right? Because adult me says, okay, addiction is addiction. People, all sorts of people get addicted, right, to different drugs, opioids, and all sorts of stuff. But I just wish she was strong enough that's the inner child. I wish she was strong enough to resist it or to get off it or something, so she could have been the mother that we were accustomed to before her addiction. And maybe he would still be alive. That's how I feel. So I was really, really upset with her during part of that. I was extremely and continue to be extremely upset and disgusted with Oklahoma. I never want to see that state again. I don't even want to fly over the state. I hate Oklahoma. I mean, seriously, with a passion. It's just an awful place, And so, so going to the prison is just mostly quiet most of the time. And, so then we got there, and then we went through the procedures of, skip the preliminaries. They had us in some place, so this is after 8 o'clock. We got there before 8. The execution was to take place at 10. This is all spelled out in writing, so you know what to expect. So between 8 and 10, we were in 2 different rooms. I think they moved us, escorted us to one place where they had, I'll never forget, they had bottled water, they had coffee, they had little snacks and stuff, and asked, if we wanted some. I'm like, are you serious? Serious? Yeah. I'm just gonna feast, right? My brother's about to be executed. So, so I didn't have any of that. And my wife did have a coffee, but, and so then from there, then they escorted us to another room, where we stayed for maybe a half hour or so. And then, about 9:30-ish, right, we were escorted to the chambers, as they say, or something like that. And so my sister was not approved because of some paperwork, so she was waiting outside. So it was me, my brother, my wife. I don't want to say other names, but there was a representative from his lawyer's office. There was a woman he'd been corresponding with, and then there was a guy from Oklahoma who, again, I'm not going to say his name, but who drove us to the prison and played such a big role. He's part of a church, a good man. So we were in this room. When we walked into the room, as we were walking to the room, I remember walking. I think we walked past which was crazy. I think we walked past the area where, we did walk past the area where I visited Donald, because it was out in the opening. So of course I looked to the side, and it's wow, I just saw him yesterday here, behind the glass, but I saw him. And we walked, like I said, this is like a mausoleum, this place, right? There's no getting out of there, meaning the construction of the place. So we walked, they escort us to the room. There were people already in the room. Later learned that the DA who prosecuted him was there. I think the police officers who arrested him was there. I didn't know any of this because they weren't dressed in, their like professional garb or whatever. Reporters were there, so there were people already there. Probably, I'm sure, the victim's family and stuff. So it was real odd, as you can imagine. We were told exactly where to sit, so it was about 5 of us. We were all sit in the front row. Everyone else, and there was tiers, like in a movie theater, or bleachers or something like that. And we couldn't see. There was two large glass, windows with shades down, right? So we couldn't see on the other side, and we just sat there for a half hour or so. When we first got there, as we were filing into this room, the officer, staff, or whatever, said to all of us, basically, like, no talking, absolutely no talking. If there's any talking, whoever's talking will be removed, right? He said, and no, I think he's also said no looking behind you or something like that. So everyone had to look forward. It was it was just like, I guess that whatever the reason is. But so obviously we complied with that. And then a few minutes to 10, we were able to see, they still had the shades, but you're able to see silhouettes, right? And you can hear low the voices, but it was low. So clearly they were bringing Donald into the chambers. And I know part of me was, probably stoic, just numb, like I don't believe this is happening, and I'm here, like party, like watching this. I don't believe this, right? It's crazy. At 10 o'clock on the dot, 10 o'clock on the dot, there was a wall. It sounded like there was a wall clock. 10 o'clock on the dot, and I had my watch on too. The curtains came up. And my brother Donald was strapped to a gurney. With all of this, with the intravenous needles already, everything they were ready to go. And then on my right, you can see all the monitors, electronic monitors, yeah, I'll never forget that. And something that my brother Sean pointed out, and this stuff makes me mad too. This stuff makes me mad, I'm telling you. Not just sad, but mad, I'm telling you. When the curtain came up and we saw Donald, he lifted his head up. He was strapped down. I couldn't move anything except his neck. And he looked up to see who was there. And Sean pointed out afterwards, I saw it, but he had a long streak. He was a tear on his left side. I'll never forget that. And he looked over at us. And I remember all the words, but I know he was saying, how much he loved us, and, that type of stuff. And he kept saying something like, I'm solid. That's what he kept saying. I'm solid. Like, I'm good. I'm solid. He, it's crazy. He wanted us to be strong, which was crazy because I could imagine being like strapped down. Like, I don't even like needles. I'm serious. Like, I don't even like going to die. I don't like needles. And I'm not like afraid, but I don't like needles. So I can't imagine being strapped down like that. But anyway, so he kept saying, I'm solid, man. I'm solid, man. Like, don't worry. I'm good. I'm basically like I'm going to be with God or something like that. I'm good, So he, in some... On some level, or maybe in a big way, I don't know, he had accepted his fate. And some of it might have to do with his 5% beliefs and stuff. But he had accepted his fate. But he was like, I'm solid, I love you. Then he was saying to the female friend who he corresponded with, he was saying, what did he say? He said, I love you, my black queen, or something like that. That was his way of saying, thank you for being here and I appreciate you, But anyway, so let me back up a little bit. So 10 o'clock, the curtain comes up. The warden, we call them superintendents, the warden stood out like he was in the room with Donald, and there was a chaplain, right? And I think one other person in the room, right, with Donald. The warden stood facing us and opened up by saying that something about I don't know if it was the pronouncement of the court or the Oklahoma Constitution, blah, blah, blah. Basically saying like this is a legal function and all this other BS or whatever, right? He's been pronounced, not pronounced, but he's been whatever, that there was an order to execute by, all this other stuff. We're following through on it, blah, 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 this and that. And that was it. He leaves out. And then I think the chaplain or whatever said a prayer, right? And then they gave Donald 2 minutes. So that's per the procedure or whatever. So he had 2 minutes for his last words. And that's when he started saying, well, actually, when it first came up, he said, I'm solid. And then they told me he had to be quiet because they had to say the prayer first. And then when he had his 2 minutes, then he was like, I'm solid. Don't worry about me, blah, blah, blah. But meanwhile, he had the tear. And during, I'm just going to speed it up because this is a painful part. But during the, while he was speaking during those 2 minutes, I think it was the machines with the IV was, it's electronic, so it was already timed. So it didn't have to be manually regulated. So it's 3 drugs. The midazolam, I think that was the main one, the main concern, right, with the courts in Oklahoma and several states. While he was talking, and we're just there, and we're like holding each other's hands, crying, right? So I had my wife on one side and my brother on the other side, and we just held I held their hands. The drugs were being administered while he was talking. And he slowly went into unconsciousness while he was talking, and then his eyes closed, and they looked swollen for some reason. His eyelids looked swollen, and I don't know if it was the drugs. Probably was the drugs. And then at some point they took his pulse and opened his eyelid, and somebody, medical person, whatever, came in, and I'll never forget the time. And it's because part of it is because it left such an indelible mark on my mind, on my psyche and my soul. But it was 10/16 when he was pronounced dead. I have a niece, my baby brother's daughter. She was born on October 16th, so it's easy to remember for that reason as well. And we cried, like I said, and then something that my wife said afterwards. So he was gone. He was dead right in front of my eyes. The warden came back in, right, and pronounced his death, right, and said whatever he said at 10/16, blah, 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 pursuant to whatever the statutes, the Constitution, all this other stuff. Donald Nathaniel Grant is dead, or whatever, pronounced dead. And this was crazy. And he stood, meaning he's behind the glass, right? All of them were behind the glass, and we're looking forward at him. He stood stoically, just looking, and then the curtains came down. While he stood there, that was the procedure. And it didn't dawn on me till after. I mean, the whole thing was cruel and just crazy. But my wife said afterwards, not immediately, but later on, she said that was like we were at a Broadway play. And we've gone to several. And I said, you're right. And what that reminds me of, and I will say it, and I hope you keep this part, I'm being honest. What that reminded me of was how, especially in the South, right? Especially in the South in the United States, how, I'm just going to say it, white people, and I'm not saying that I feel any way towards white people, it's just a fact. This is a fact. We're talking facts. Would gather around a tree that they've lynched some black person, usually a black person, some white people too, and would watch as they burned someone, either on a cross or on a tree, or hung somebody, lynched someone, and would watch. And that's what that whole procedure was. I said, this is a lynching. This is a modern day. It was just unbelievable. And so after that, we were escorted out. We were in the front, so we were the first ones out. And I'm going to be honest, I'm not going to say everything that I felt and thought. I'm going to be honest. I'm not going to say it, but you can kind of guess. But I had never in my life, I'm 52 now, so I was 51, because my birthday is in April. That was in January. I had never been so angry in my life, and I experienced a lot of stuff in my life, including in prison, maximum security prisons. I've been angry numerous times, like anybody else. I've never been that angry, and I'll just leave it at that.
Okay. So, one last question. And you've already kind of answered how you feel about the death penalty, I think.
Yeah.
Go ahead. You want to say that?
Well, I just think that it doesn't, I let me say this. I get, and I'm not minimizing in any way, not just in my brother's case, but in any case, the loss of a loved one is painful. It's no joke. I just lost him, right? Now, even if I hadn't gone to prison myself, right? Just like my sister hasn't, and a whole bunch of people haven't. I get the pain, the loss. This will stay with me for the rest of my life, just like I'm sure it will with the victims of my brother's crime. I get it. But a life for a life is not the answer. It's just not the answer. And even when we were, the day of, when we were at the prison, I said to the chaplain, and he's like, oh, you're preaching to the choir. I have my thoughts about him, but I said, I don't know which part of the Bible you all, I hate to say it like that, read, but the Old Testament is eye for an eye, but that's not what Jesus talked about. I'm not even religious. I believe in God, but that's not what he taught. I know that for certain. So I don't know which part of it. Maybe they only got the half of the Bible or something like that. I don't know, right? Seriously, that's that. Because it doesn't solve anything. In fact, statistics show. Now I know people might say, "Well, screw statistics. I lost a loved one, and so he just got his just desserts." People are entitled to feel whatever they feel. The bottom line is, it doesn't deter anyone. In the states that have the death penalty, they have higher rates of homicide than the states that don't. So people are not calculating and say, "Oh, well, I'm not going to commit this crime because I might be executed." Obviously, the circumstances are individual and some are systemic. It's much broader than just saying, "Oh, these individuals are awful, so they should be executed." And I would say, I don't want to stand on a soapbox, and it is steeped in racism. That is the truth. Historically speaking, black and brown people are disproportionately executed. That's not a coincidence. What is it? Because we commit more crimes? No, absolutely not. It's race and it's socioeconomics. That's the story of America. That's just the truth. That's the story of America. It's not my truth. It's an objective truth, right? So I'm totally against the death penalty. It doesn't deter anyone. I believe it or not, people might think. I have friends who are still in prison, and one dear friend has a sentence of 62 and a half to life. 62 and a half because they ran his sentences consecutively. He's been in for 37 years. He was 22, he's 60 now. That, to me, is a virtual death penalty. My point is that you don't have to have the death penalty. If you want to make a point, meaning it's any given state, you just give people life without parole. Prison is not fun. It's not fun. It leaves you scarred, right, for life in some ways. So I just think that it doesn't serve anyone. So anyway, so I'm totally against it.
So, last question is, what do you think about when you think about Donald?
When I think about Donald, and this is something I told my wife, Donald, and I'm not just saying this, I mean this, and I think, to be honest, what I'm about to say, I think because we were younger, and this is the reason why I sometimes have felt guilt, because I didn't spend a lot of time with him. And when I was coming of age, I was hanging out with older people, had girlfriends, stuff like that. I wasn't hanging out with my little brother. But in hindsight, I wish I had, right? But what I'm getting at is that, especially in the last several years, like I said, I've been home 6 years now, and so I spoke to Donald throughout the entire time. But within the last several months and year that I spoke to him a lot more frequently, right? Because for obvious reasons, and sometimes for like several calls. It would be good, that we had that connection, but it would be exhausting. It would be exhausting for me, if emotionally, psychologically, especially, our mother had passed away, and so who could I talk to? I talked to my wife about it, but what I'm getting at is that what I found is that people, you have to know Donald to know Donald, if that makes sense. And he was actually, and he said this, and it was true. Although his crime was horrific, I would say, horrific is a better word, he was full of love. Believe it or not. Like, really, I'm not just saying it because he's my brother. In talking to him, I really got to know him in a way that I didn't know when we were younger. And even certain things, like with me, like sometimes he had Like I've met people. One person just came from Germany. I met her and recently, like last month. But I'm in communication with other people who are like supporters of anti-death penalty supporters, and so sometimes he would say to me, like, and so some of them sent the money and stuff and say, okay, for the phone or for the canteen and stuff. And he would offer me money. Like, he's on death row offering me money. I'm like, no, I'm like, no, I'm fine. Because he might say, once or twice, he might ask me to do something. I might say, oh, well, I got to wait till I get paid and blah, blah. He said, oh, well, if you need money, I'll. And I'm like, this guy. But that's who Donald was. He was very giving, very loving, believe it or not. Because what I know, even before the situation, is that, and I use myself as an example, to be honest, good people do bad things. Good people do bad things all the time. We do it all the time. Right? We just don't get caught, right? Whatever it might be, it doesn't have to be a crime. It could be infidelity. Good people do bad things, And so with Donald, he was a good person. What he did was horrible, right? But he was a very good-hearted person. And so 2 things that I really learned from him that I really hadn't thought about, to be honest, was 1, how good of a person he was, how much he loved, really loved. And it's sad, it's so sad. Not just him, but the crime and the victims. It's sad because I really believe that he committed the crime out of love for this woman. He didn't do it for himself. It was like, it's crazy. It's almost like self-sacrifice. He didn't do it for himself. If it was for him, he would have just, he wouldn't have done it. I know that to be true. He could have done it earlier. Like, you know what I'm saying? It was like, this was for this woman. And he even said it during his clemency hearing, now that I remember. And he broke down crying. He was going to go a different route, and I told him, I said, man, you got to show some remorse. And he was like, oh, they're going to do whatever they're going to do. I said, that's not the point. You need to show remorse. So he did. And he said, I'll never forget this. He broke down crying. He didn't cry at any other point. He cried during the clemency hearing when he mentioned the woman's name and that he had committed the crime for her. And he said, I loved her, and I thought she loved me too. He said, and he started crying, and he said, apparently she didn't, because she turned states on him, said, oh, he kidnapped me. He didn't care. She was down with that stuff. So his love was deep. When you kill for another person, you really, either you love them or you're crazy or both. I mean, you know what I'm saying? It's just that, So, 1, that he loved and he was giving, and 2, that he was so, I didn't know this too, he was so brutally honest, even more than me. You know what I'm saying? I'm being honest. He was like, some things he would say. When he said that for example, when he said, oh, I was born into the wrong family, that was his truth. Mm-hmm. He has said other stuff, and I was like, wow, this guy's deep. Like, my little brother is pretty deep. And he speaks the truth. When he said, and I think some of it is just him being just blatantly honest, and some I chalk it up as mental health, but I don't know. But like when he also, during the clemency hearing, when he outright said that he told himself before going in that he was not going to leave any witnesses. You can't be more truthful or honest than that. I thought it was crazy. I would have never, ever, ever said it, even if that was my thinking. I just would not. I'm being honest. So my point is that he, what I think of Donald is that he was very loving, had a good heart, a really good heart, only wanted to be loved. That's all he wanted, like anybody else. And that if he had received the love from my mother and the support of different institutions, and I don't mean just like correctional institutions, just like, mental health and school and stuff like that, that his life would have turned out differently. So that's what I'm saying. And you know, I miss him, and I will, you know, so every now and then I'll like, you know, he used to drive me crazy sometimes on them phone calls. But you know, initially I really missed it, and even now, every now and then I'm like, wow, damn, he's not calling me today or whatever. Yeah. So yeah.
Well, let me. It is 1:22.